You're listening to The Switch. The Switch is a podcast about ideas and experiences that change our minds. In this episode, we speak with Daniel Miller. Danny is a lawyer and activist. He's had work featured in the Washington Post, Newsweek, Vice, Playboy, and many other publications. He studied astrophysics at Princeton University and got a law degree from Georgetown Law. We have a very in-depth discussion with Danny about the Constitution, free speech, and the value of the marketplace of ideas. We also discuss the current U.S. political climate.
If you like what we do here on The Switch, the best way to support us is through Patreon. For as little as $1, you can become part of the community, ask us questions, suggest topics, and directly communicate with us. You can also unlock bonus content like extra questions we ask our guests. If you want more of The Switch, both on topic and off, you can become a patron at www.patreon.com/switch_podcast. You can also check us out on social media. On Instagram and Twitter, we are at switch_podcast. And on Facebook, we are The Switch Podcast. The Switch is produced by Mojo Filter Media, a company specializing in audio production for video games and interactive media. You can check out our website at www.mojofilter.media.
And so, without further delay, we start with a quote from Jonathan Rauch, author of Kindly Inquisitors. The great problem in society is how you deal with conflict. If it's conflict over resources, you use markets, and the token that you use is the exchange of goods, commodities, resources. In politics, you're allocating power, and the mechanism you use is exchange of compromise and votes. In intellectual life, the question is, who is right? Who has the truth? You deal with that through exchange of criticism. Everyone gets to talk. Everyone gets to put hypotheses out there. All get criticized. There's no end to this game. It is, like all liberal systems, an open-ended, depersonalized, rule-based system. At the end of the day, whichever hypotheses are still standing is our knowledge, always subject to further change. It depends on criticism. In fact, it vitally depends on offending people. That's the foundation of it. But a lot of people have forgotten that, and they think science is all supposed to be people in white lab coats being nice to each other. Well, that's not where knowledge comes from. And with that, I'd like to introduce our guest for today, Daniel Miller. Danny, welcome to The Switch.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. I'm very happy to be here and excited to talk to you about free speech. Lots of important issues to discuss.
Oh, yeah. Before we launch into free speech, I want to get a little background on you and where you came from, sort of your story. So, why don't you just tell us, like, where did you grow up?
Where did I grow up? So my background story is going to be different, I suppose. Well, everyone has a unique background story. I've sort of gone on a couple different paths, but I grew up in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., and went to college in New Jersey at Princeton. I majored in physics, and like my hope, I guess, while I was studying physics was to be a physicist, was to search for truth in the universe, to figure out the governing principles of our planet, of the solar system. I think the people that were really guiding me at that point were the people I was reading about in my physics textbooks, whether it was Newton or Einstein. But I think at some point at Princeton, I realized I was not nearly intelligent enough to be a good physicist.
So what was how did you transition to, you have a law degree as well?
Yeah.
Right?
So the transition, after I graduated college, I actually went to Egypt for about a year and a half to study Arabic. My father was a diplomat, and I thought perhaps I might want to sort of follow his footsteps, become a foreign service officer, or maybe even work for the CIA. And so I went to study Arabic. And I think I realized I actually learned a lot about free speech, even living in Egypt and being around people that had completely different views than me that really offended deeply who I was as a person. I learned how to coexist with those people. I was forced to. But I think while I was living in Egypt, no matter how much I really benefited from that experience, I realized I didn't want to live a life as a diplomat. I didn't want to live overseas. So I returned to the United States. I didn't apply to the Foreign Service. I did a couple different jobs, but I eventually applied to law school. And I sort of saw law school as an extension of my search for truth that I endeavored to begin in college. The law is about searching for truth in the intellectual realm, as opposed to searching for truth in the physical one. And I had a really positive experience in law school. Most people, I think, hate law school. I loved law school. And so, I finished law school in 2011 at Georgetown. And then I clerked for a judge for a year. And that brings us to about 2012, I think. And I mean, I can keep going, just tell you how I got to this point sitting right here in front of you guys. So I continued, I clerked for a federal judge in Ohio, and then I worked for 2 more years at an organization that represented big business in Ohio. I'm not a Republican, but I believed in some of the things that organization was doing, and I did a lot of work advocating for education policy in the state of Ohio. I didn't really like my job necessarily, or like the career path I had gone on. I think my entire life I was really on a certain narrow path, and it was really hard to just take a break from it and try to figure out what I actually wanted to do. Not what other people had told me I should do, but really have an honest conversation with myself about what I should do. I quit my job and went to California to live with a couple of friends. I actually had some psychedelic experiences with them. And I came to New York having had these profound experiences. One of them helped me quit smoking. I quit cold turkey before, but the experience basically just ended my addiction. And I just started advocating for psychedelics. It seemed like the right thing to do. I really truly believed in the cause, in the potential for psychedelic medicine. And that's kind of what I was doing in New York for, I'd say, a year and a half, until a couple months before the presidential election in 2016. And a couple months before the presidential election 2016, I was already sort of losing interest in the psychedelic space, I suppose, for a variety of reasons. But I just looked at our political situation, and I felt really, really scared isn't the right word. I think I was alarmed. I was alarmed that there was a candidate, a nominee for president for the Republican Party that I viewed represented a worse tribal instincts, that represented authoritarian impulses, that I didn't believed in democracy. And he had a chance to become president. And I needed to do something, however small. And so I drove to Columbus, Ohio, and I worked for Hillary Clinton's campaign. I volunteered as an attorney for her campaign for a month and a half. Obviously, that election did not turn out the way I wanted, but when I returned, I realized I needed to continue to do anything I could to help with that, with our political situation. I think for so much of my life, I looked at our political situation, and I just sort of taken it for granted that we had a politically stable country, that we had political leaders that believed in our governing documents and governing principles, that believed in checks and balances and separation of powers and the rule of law. And I was alarmed about the Iraq War. But other than that, I really never, I always viewed George W. Bush as somebody who cared about democracy. I always viewed each of the presidents since I became politically conscious, no matter how socially no matter how different my perspective was from theirs on any individual public policy, I always believed they were doing their job to help the American people and to help our country move forward and to reach its potential. I don't think some of them did a very good job of it, but they were trying. And I looked at them and I saw a reflection of myself, and I saw a reflection of other Americans who wanted the best for America. And what I saw in Trump was the exact opposite. And I just needed to do something. So I returned to New York after the election, and I started a civics group called the Society for Constitutional Protection. And on Meetup, I started an organization advocating for psychedelics on Meetup, and so I sort of knew the lay of the land. But so I started this group on Meetup, and I started holding presentations and lectures where I would talk about the Constitution. And I've been doing that for about a year and a half. I've also I've started doing a number of other things as well in the same vein. So that's how I ended up in front of you today. I view free speech in the same light as I view all the other things I've talked about: rule of law, separation of powers, federalism. They're all really part and parcel of us having a civilized country where the people rule themselves and not ruled by others. And free speech is just really fundamental to that.
So I do want to get into some of those principles, but I want to ask how did growing up with a father as a diplomat and having the various experiences you've had, how did that shape your politics? Like, or did you notice any change from your politics when you first sort of started to realize them at a younger age to now? What does that look like?
I think I'm not a Republican. I'm an independent, although I voted for Democrats. I didn't vote in 2004, which I regret. But every election I voted in for president, I voted for the Democrat. But it hasn't been a situation where I've reflexively voted for the Democrat. It's when I've actually looked at the candidates and decided that the Democrat's more in line with my philosophy and my politics than the Republican. But in terms of having the father as a diplomat, I think what I saw my dad was in the U.S. government. And I saw the U.S. government as a force for good. A lot of people see the U.S. government as a force for ill, something that's part of a broken system that's corrupt, or officials are trying to benefit themselves rather than help the people that elected the public officials. But I saw the U.S. government comprised of people that really worked hard every day, that tried to make our lives better, that often spent long periods of time away from their family in service of like a higher objective, higher goal, in service of their country. I looked at it as a good thing, as a virtuous thing. And my dad was also an historian, like a trained historian. So I learned about American history growing up, and not just the good parts. I mean, I learned about everything. And I think I had like a very sort of holistic understanding of America. And I came to appreciate how blessed I was, privileged I was to be living here as opposed to so many other places. And that's not to say there aren't people in this country that are really suffering, but like all the places I could have been born, all the times I could have been born, to be born where I was, just kiss the ground you walk on. You're born in America, not somewhere else. So that's sort of how it framed my perspective. It's almost like I reached college age and I was very post-partisan. I've never really been partisan. Maybe that's a problem, but yeah, that's how I became an advocate. That's all the different ways I became an advocate for free speech, I guess.
Yeah. So in your, you built this meetup group, the Society for Constitutional Protection.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people in modern political discourse hear about, the U.S. Constitution, and, obviously kids in U.S. public schools learn about the Constitution to some degree, but I definitely get a feeling in modern political discourse that people don't have a good idea of what the Constitution is, sort of what it's for, where it came from, like what the context of this document is. So before we get into some of the principles like rule of law and federalism, what is the Constitution as a document? What is it? What's it for?
It's a great question. So I'm actually giving a presentation on the Federalist Papers on Saturday. And the Federalist Papers were a series of papers that were advocating for the ratification of the Constitution. So to give you some context, the year is 1787. This is 6 years or so removed from beating the British in the Revolutionary War, but our country was really suffering. Our first Constitution was called the Articles of Confederation, and we just weren't doing well as a nation under that Constitution. We had a lot of debt, both from the state level and the federal level. We incurred to beat the British. We didn't have a president. We didn't have an independent judiciary. The Continental Congress couldn't levy taxes or regulate commerce. So our founders convened in Philadelphia, the summer of 1787, to both amend the Articles of Confederation, but they ended up just changing it to the Constitution that we know today. And their main goal was to empower our federal government with the rights and responsibilities and powers that it would need to govern a nation, that it would need to protect us from enemies, foreign and domestic. It gave the Congress the ability to pay for things that a nation would need, to levy taxes, to regulate commerce. So that's sort of the Constitution. That's what the Constitution did. But our founders also understood the danger of empowering centralized authority, and they sought within the Constitution to establish a structure that would protect us from a number of different forms of tyranny, all the while empowering the federal government. So the question before them was, how do you empower the federal government while protecting the people from corrupted power? And that's where separation of powers and checks and balances comes from. That's from the rule of law. That's not where the rule of law comes from, but the rule of law and federalism, all these other principles are enshrined in our Constitution to sort of protect us from corrupted power that could result from empowering this new federal government.
I was browsing your YouTube channel, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and you have these sort of 6 constitutional principles. I don't know if this is a metric or a structure that you came up with, or if this is actually like a more more formal way of sorting through the principles here. But I just want to hit these one at a time and sort of get your explanation of each of these things. So the first one is rule of law, that nobody's above the law. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think if you look at throughout history, the vast majority of nations were nations of men, not law. People were under the thumb of dictators or oligarchs or autocrats or monarchs or kings. They didn't rule themselves. There were other people that told them, they could take their property when they chose. They could take their lives when they chose. They could take their liberty whenever they wanted. There was no law established that authority had to follow before depriving people of those essential things in life. Rule of law is a principle that came originally from the British in 1215 and the Magna Carta. But the way I see it is, yes, in a rule of law society like ours, nobody is above the law, and everybody that's under it, which includes everybody, including the most powerful people like the president, must abide by the law and then face the consequences for breaking it. So in the context of America today, when the president says that he can fire Mueller or pardon himself, he's basically saying that he is above the law, which goes against 800 years of Western thought and democratic practice. And it's a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't think there's a lot of people in our generation that really have a perspective for anything other than the rule of law. That's what we've always had. And we grew up in a time where that was never at stake, it seemed like. So I think a lot of people our age might have a problem taking the threat to it seriously.
No, absolutely. People have completely lost touch with they never understood the constituent parts of our society and our democracy because they never had to fight for them. Mm-hmm. They never the generation that fought in World War II, they didn't experience tyranny, but they saw it. They saw what would happen when dictators took over other countries. We haven't had those experiences. It's like a fish doesn't know it's in water until it's out of water, and it feels like we're slowly being dragged out of our quote unquote water, and we're slowly realizing how essential it is. So yeah, rule of law is just one of those fundamental aspects of democratic societies that we're hopefully will understand and fight for in the coming years and decades.
Yeah. Okay, so the next principle is democracy.
So just to answer your first question, which was how did I come up with these 6 topics?
Oh, sure.
I just think that they sounded good, and they're principles that I just wanted to select the principles that I think Americans need to know about now.
Yeah.
That we've sort of ignored for a long time. So democracy is just the notion that people should rule themselves and not be ruled by others, as opposed to autocracy, which in Greek means rule by the one, or oligarchy, which means rule by the few. Democracy means rule by the many, and yeah, it stems from the idea that the people are legitimate sources of political power. For most of human history, the people were not legitimate sources of political power. God was a source of political power. Heredity was a source of political power. But there was a long period of evolution from the Magna Carta to our Revolutionary War. But I think it sort of culminated in the idea that each person has inherent value and worth. And so if each person has inherent value and worth, then political authority should stem from individuals, from the people, and not from people that are by virtue of their birth better than anybody else. So that's democracy. And I think, again, just another principle we sort of haven't focused on from a theoretical perspective.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it almost seems like the modern perspective of most people is we've got sort of an autocracy, except we, as people get to choose who's at the top. Like that seems like the way a lot of people think of the presidency. It's like, okay, we get to elect him, but once he's there, he's all powerful, and that's sort of it for 4 years or 8 years. But yeah, it's definitely an important principle to understand that, people are ultimately the government is accountable to the people because people elect officials. People elect their representatives, and theoretically that keeps them, I don't want to say honest, but
honest, absolutely honest. The founders did not trust the people. The founders didn't trust the governors, the representatives, the president. The whole system's in place because the founders didn't trust anybody. They didn't trust human beings. So maybe they were right not to trust any of us.
I agree. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about federalism?
Yeah, federalism is just a principle of how we divide power in this country between the states on one hand and the federal government on the other. Our society, our country is structured completely differently than how other countries are structured. Because in this country, there are originally 13 states that viewed themselves as sovereign nations. They had the powers of a sovereign nation, the power to coin money, to regulate commerce, to levy taxes, to make peace and war with other states and other countries. And when they came together, they delegated some of those original powers to the federal government. And the federal government only really has those powers that were delegated to them by the states. Mm-hmm. The states retain all the other powers. So if you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it's a list of the enumerated powers of the federal government. And there aren't that many. So the federal government's a government of limited power, and the states are governments of plenary power, of general power. They have so much more power and responsibility than the federal government, which is, I think, most Americans don't realize, but the vast majority of governing every day happens in the local and state level. And so that's federalism. And that just differentiates us from so many other places. Just a good story, my first year in law school, my constitutional law professor looked at his watch and he said, at 3 p.m. in France, President Sarkozy knows what each French student is studying, because there was nationalized curriculum. But there are tens of thousands of different school boards in America that each has their own curriculum, at least potentially, and that stems because education is a power reserved to the states. It's not in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So that's federalism, more or less.
Yeah, and I definitely hear, again, going back to modern political discourse, I definitely hear this mantra of states' rights, especially from the right. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand the beauty of that and the idea of, like, it's almost an experimental system where you can have, like, if you really think that this style of education or this curriculum is better or more efficient or whatever has attributes that you desire, you can sort of test it out in a localized way, whether it's a local school district or a state, however that's divided up. But that's the experiment across the board politically. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that as a system.
Yeah, there's beauty, and it's also another protection against tyranny. No matter how dysfunctional the federal government is, no matter how tyrannous the president is, there's just so much power in the local and state level, so many different ways we can push back and get involved.
Yeah. Okay, so next is nature of power. I've got checks and balances here.
Yeah, checks and balances and separation of power. So even though the power in this country is divided up between the federal government on one hand, the states on the other, and in part that's to protect the states from the tyranny of the federal government, there's still a lot of power left over in the federal government. The president's a commander-in-chief of a military, of an armed forces. The Congress can levy taxes, regulate commerce, decide immigration policy. So how do you protect the people from the concentration of power on the federal level? How do you protect the people from one person or a small group of people from having too much power on the federal level? And the way you do that is through separation of powers. First, it's to divide up all the power there is on the federal level into three branches of government, so that not any one branch has too much of it. So you have the executive branch, the legislative branch, Article 1, the executive branch in Article 2, and the judiciary in Article 3. So that's separation of powers. And then checks and balances is our founders understood that even though they divided up power between these three branches of government, that power is of an encroaching nature. So senators would try to take power from House members. House members would try to take power from the president. The president would try to take power from the Congress. And then everybody would try to take power from the judiciary. So how do you protect each of these spheres of power from the others? How do you protect the Senate and the House from usurpations by the president and vice versa? And you do it through checks and balances. So you give each of these branches of government sort of a constitutional weapon to protect themselves from usurpations. So the Congress their weapon of choice is impeachment and removal. They can remove a dutifully elected president from office through impeachment and a trial in the Senate. And what's the protection of the president? Well, he can veto legislation that's passed by the Congress. And then the courts can declare laws to be laws that are passed by the House and Senate and then signed by the president. The courts can declare those laws to be invalid because they're unconstitutional. So each branch of government really does have a strong sort of check on the others. And that's the nature of power. They understood that people weren't angels. So we needed government. We needed governments to regulate our behavior. They also understood that the people that comprised governments weren't angels either. So they needed to somehow figure out a way to protect us from those folks. And that I just sort of took a quote from the Federalist Papers right there. But that's I think that's the nature of power. They lived firsthand under the tyranny of a king. So they understood what happens when someone had too much power.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So then lastly, we can sort of transition into the main thing that I really wanted to talk to you about here, which is free speech, the marketplace of ideas, and hand in hand with that would be free press.
So, yeah, I mean, I think free speech in the marketplace of ideas and the free press are essential to a democracy. I think John Milton wrote, there was a British licensing order in 1643, I believe, and it basically was a restriction on who could operate a printing press, like who could publish books. And John Milton wrote a response to it, I think it's called Areopagitica. And in it are some really powerful arguments for the marketplace of ideas and for free speech. But basically in society, the British weren't a free society then, but free enough. His point was that in such a society, the people need to figure out what ideas are right or wrong, good or bad, true or false. The people need to figure out what ideas are righteous and unrighteous. It's not for the government to impose consensus, it's for the people to figure out consensus through discussion and debate. He talks about the problems with censorship. Who exactly would be the censor? Who would sign up for such a job? It'd be the worst among us that signed up for the job to be the government censor. Even if you could decide on what ideas were right or wrong, who exactly would you give that responsibility to? But yeah, the ideas in that sort of formed or formulated the whole idea of a marketplace of ideas, which is underpinning our First Amendment and free speech in this country, because we are a free society. I would actually sort of like to return to how some people think that maybe you guys think that we have this autocrat as president for 4 or 8 years. I fundamentally disagree, but just aspirationally at least, we want a society in which the people, because they're the ones voting for representatives who make decisions, we want the people to have a mechanism to figure out the truth, to discriminate between right and wrong, and Milton talks about the importance of truth grappling with falsity. It's okay for there to be ideas that are false. It's okay for there to be ideas that are offensive because truth will prevail. But you need to give truth the chance to prevail, and you need this open discourse. And that's what, at least from my mind, the First Amendment or the free speech part of the First Amendment's about.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, there's this sort of separation between freedom of speech as a legal principle and free speech as a cultural value. But I don't think you can have one without the other. Like a lot of people, so the modern sort of instantiation of this would be something like a private company like Twitter or YouTube sort of cracking down on making sure certain ideas are not visible to their audience. And the debate is really whether this is like censorship from the legal perspective, whether it's just a sort of bad idea to not let these ideas percolate, and it's just that company doing something that isn't in the best interest of everybody, or like I said, whether it's actual legal censorship. Do you have any thoughts on?
I just think that the law stems from culture.
Yeah,
you can't have the law if people don't believe in the law.
Yeah,
and if people don't understand the importance of free speech and why it's here, I mean, there are sort of individualistic elements of free speech, right? It's important for people to express themselves, to figure out, to have creative outlets, to voice their political opinions, unattached to the polity itself. But it's just important as an individual to have that freedom and that liberty. But then there are elements of freedom of speech which are really tied to having a functioning society. I mean, first, it's important to have robust and rigorous discourse, because otherwise, how are we going to figure out what's right and wrong? But it's also really important for us to learn how to live with each other, to be reasonable and logical thinkers, we need to be able to interact with folks that have different ideas. This is a really big country with it seems like dozens of religions, dozens of cultures. There are so many different things here that would bother me, that bother you, but it's important for us to learn how to compromise with people around us, because we're sharing the same resources, we're sharing the same land. Compromise is our only option. If we don't compromise, what are the alternatives? And I think free speech, just as a value, disregarding whether or not what the law is, just as a cultural principle, it's important for us to value that norm, that people can say what they want within certain bounds, and we can have a debate about it. Because if we're just going to shut people down, where does that lead us? Eventually, that will affect our politics, and I think it has. Yeah.
You said I caught a little piece of something that you said. You said within certain bounds. I mean, I am on board so far, but I just want to expand on that within certain bounds caveat that you gave. What are, first of all, legally, what are the bounds that we have to free speech or free expression?
Legally, there are many different sort of exceptions to free speech. One would be incitement. So if you say something which is likely to induce imminent lawlessness, it's a very high standard to meet. But there are all these cases in the 19-teens in which you had folks that were like writing leaflets trying to induce other people not to join the draft, or to cause insubordination regarding regarding issues related to World War I. Those cases, I believe, have been overturned by the Supreme Court. But generally, there's a very sort of high standard to meet for incitement. In terms of obscenity, not obscenity like cussing, like things that have absolutely no cultural, artistic value, so like animal porn, I think would constitute obscenity, is not protected speech. There are sort of different commercial speech can be regulated somewhat. But really, and we do have, in this country compared to Europe, we have really robust laws protecting speech, especially political speech. No matter how offensive the idea, it's essentially protected in this country because, again, truth is supposed to conquer falsity. We shouldn't have someone impose consensus. We should figure out consensus for ourselves. But if you're asking me, with outside of the law, because the First Amendment only really is regulating what the government can do regarding your speech. But I don't think racism has any place in the workplace. Yeah. I mean, and sure, there are probably laws regarding that as well that aren't stemming from our Constitution, that are stemming from federal statute. I mean, to be honest, I haven't really examined the place of speech in an office setting, for example. Yeah. I'm trying to think through, like, for the first time right now, like if I were at my workplace, what sort of speech would I want to prohibit? Yeah. I think the question which really is on our minds today is what sort of speech should we prohibit or limit in the academic environment? Yeah. What sort of speech should we limit in a university environment, an intellectual environment? And the purpose of those institutions is to sort of seek the truth. So it seems very bizarre that there would be restrictions on what people can say, or there would be an environment which really undermines people's willingness to voice their opinion because of a backlash. And we need to protect people's ability to voice controversial opinions in academic settings. I think it's absolutely essential.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally on board with that. I think so. I definitely. So I don't know if I've talked to you about this. I know when we met, we talked briefly, but so Alex and I actually both went to Berklee College of Music in Boston, which is a very it's a liberal arts school. Most of the people and staff. It's very sort of hard left leaning, and in some cases, like that's pretty typical of the American education environment. But in some cases, I think you see sort of the lapse in this principle of free expression and the exchange of ideas being how you approach better ideas. Oh shoot, I just forgot where I was going to go with that.
Well, it's okay. It's okay. I think, I'm trying to think back to my own college experience, and I think that if I went to college now, I'd have real trouble because I say controversial things. In part is because I happen to hold controversial ideas. Mm-hmm. In part, it's because I like stirring the pot. But I don't think anything I've ever really said has been outside the bounds of that I would consider worth condemning. I mean, in fact, I'm sure that nothing I've said has been that I should have been censored by some academic institution or by the student body. But I'm thinking right now, if I went to one of those, if I was back in college, what would happen if I got in the same arguments as I did in 2003? I'm not sure. I mean, there are certain kinds of conversations with which people sort of have to tiptoe around. They're sort of embargoed issues, and I think that's a big problem. And I'm not really sure. I think there are probably several different causes for it. I think if you're acculturated, like if you grow up in a culture where you have a thin skin and you're acculturated to believe that's okay, then speech will actually feel violent to you. It will feel like a personal attack.
That's actually sort of where I was going to go with this.
Okay.
My thoughts are back on track now. So I think one of the things that I saw, and maybe even part of the opinion that I used to hold, I definitely don't hold this now, but I think there's a fear that in a setting like an institution where you have, or like an academic institution where you have, people who are young, people who are figuring their ideas out, that certain ideas are so, I guess, harmful or so toxic that when you mix that with impressionable people and people who haven't quite figured out how to engage with ideas fully yet, that either they will cause some irreparable harm as ideas, like you could potentially indoctrinate someone into some harmful idea that they don't really have the intellectual defense against, or sort of on the same line as that there will be inadequate public pushback, and you'll get sort of the psychology of groups of people who think different things, and you don't actually get the raw clash of ideas that you would maybe get with, I don't know, some more intellectually robust people. So I think that's the fear that people have, or the reason that people have this impulse to cover up and censor certain ideas, especially on campus. What are your thoughts on that as a sort of defense of campus censorship? And I just want to be clear, that's not my view.
You mean
I would push
the
back
defense against campus censorship would be that it protects people from censors?
Yeah, from harmful ideas, or that it creates an environment where, I guess, it basically protects people from
part of. I think one of the things you realize living in the Middle East is that there's a vulnerable population, folks that are trying to fill a void with something. Mm-hmm. And the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful, good, decent human beings. The vast majority of Muslims in the Middle East are good, decent human beings. It's just a small fraction of people that are driven to fundamentalism. That being said, there's a vulnerable population in the Middle East because civil society is broken down, and it's as if these fanatical ideas, these fundamentalist ideas, are especially attractive. They fill a void of some kind. They fill a spiritual void of some kind. So listening to you talking about kids on campus now vulnerable to being propagandized or falling victim to certain ideologies makes me really nervous. And I also just have to push back. I think, you're on college campus and you see people that are yelling and screaming a lot. Maybe I don't know. I haven't been in college campus for a while, but I don't think that people in this country are nearly as vulnerable to being indoctrinated as they are in vulnerable populations in the Middle East. I think there's an element of that. You sort of see the same dynamic, but it's much less insidious here. It's much less far gone here. We can definitely recover here. So to answer your question, do I think that we should protect people from ideas? No, because I don't think, I hesitate to say we should protect people from ideas under any circumstance, but especially in America, on college campuses, we have professors, we have an environment that should be inclusive, that should encourage the exchange of ideas, that should expose people to people and ideas and cultures and religions outside their own bubble. These are all really good things, and they cause pain. They cause people to have to, lots of people in college, the first semester, after reading any number of philosophers, they go down any number of dead ends philosophically. They'll probably call their parents, be like, I've discovered the meaning of life. Oh, I know exactly. No, you just thought you did because you don't have the intellectual maturity and rigor to test the ideas that you thought were fascinating in class. But that's all part of the learning process and maturing as a thinker, and especially on a college campus where people are really just trying to figure this stuff out for themselves for the first time. We need to encourage it, and it's messy. And I guess when there's so many different things to talk about. First, being offended is not fun. Being offended as a member of the historically a marginalized group in our society, as a person of color, first of all, I'm not saying that certain words shouldn't be condemned and repudiated on college campuses. But in terms of offensive ideas, I really do think people need to learn to be around them, because it will prepare them for the real world. It will prepare their minds to grapple with the fact that reality isn't nice all the time, that life isn't pretty all the time, and that they don't have a monopoly on truth. I think one of the dangers is you protect people from dangerous ideas, and before you know it, people think that what they know is all that there is. So I guess to answer your question is, how would you protect people from extremely insensitive ideas or offensive ideas without also acculturating them to believe that they know the way, that they know the truth?
I don't think you can. I'm on your side here. I think that, people should absolutely, the place of university is to expose people to ideas that they have to learn how to figure out if they think. You absolutely can't let people get to a place where they forget the sort of first principles of the things that they know. There's a great quote from Christopher Hitchens that I almost used as my opening quote, but he talks about how, the whole point of free speech, or one of the major points of free speech, especially protecting free speech for people with offensive ideas, is that it forces you to grapple with first principles. He talks about flat earthers, right? People who think the earth is flat. And this is a fairly tame example, because most people aren't offended by flat earthers. They just think, well, that's a person who doesn't understand. But it forces you to ask the question of yourself, how do I know that the earth is round? And then maybe you'll go and look at it, and you'll have a more robust understanding of some knowledge you may have taken for granted previously. But I think with offensive ideas, that process is harder, but all the more important. And that's what university's for.
Absolutely. I think in terms of global warming or evolution, how many people that are fearless advocates for those things don't really understand either? And I think knowledge, and that's not to denigrate people. I think, it's okay to trust the experts in society, to value them, to rely on their judgment. At the same time, to be an informed citizen, you sort of need to understand the issues yourself. And the more knowledge becomes set, the more it becomes dogmatic. And so, yeah, you need to sort of break consensus once in a while. Hitchens talks about Holocaust deniers and how, the Holocaust happened. 6 million Jews were exterminated in it. But the one person that wants to say, contrary to all the evidence that exists, that the Holocaust didn't happen, I personally want to know what's driving that person, what's motivating that hate and that insanity. Like, I want to get to the bottom of that. And simply ignoring it, I don't think helps anybody. What is the exact emotional dynamic, psychological dynamic that created that guy? And does he have friends? And what are they doing? Like, I want to know, like, what is the undercurrent in our society? I think the more you sort of ignore it, the more it sort of grows in secret. And then they elect candidates to office that are anathema to everything you believe in.
And I don't want to stick on the university thing too long, Chase, but since we were using that as an example, do you think we could kind of mention some of the things that are going on? Like, what are these views that are considered harmful and that are banned, just so, people who are not in college or around that or hearing about it, what are we talking about, basically?
Yeah, I mean, we could definitely jump in. Danny, is there an issue of choice that you think is one that's a good example of this? I mean, I can bring up examples as well, but if there's one that you think highlights this, what we're talking about.
Just to interrupt for 1 second, I think it's important as I looked at your questions before the podcast. I always hesitate to simply concentrate on university and students, which bother me. I mean, they do bother me because obviously there's a failure to appreciate the importance of the marketplace of ideas and free thought. And as somebody who holds controversial ideas a lot of the time, I really depend on those freedoms. At the same time, I think we need to acknowledge that the bubbles in college campuses didn't just rise by themselves in a vacuum. And in my mind, the tribalism we see in the left is primarily a function to protect marginalized communities from the tribalism on the right. And it's really sometimes hard to acknowledge or to see the line from one to the other. But in my mind, the tribalism on the left is a way to grapple with and to help people. It doesn't mean that I think it's effective, it doesn't mean that I don't think there are more effective ways to go about it. But do I think that those folks are in good faith trying to pick up those less fortunate? Yes. Do I think that they're trying to do good in the world? Absolutely. Are they responding to people that fundamentally don't believe in equality? Yes. So I don't want to just sit here and look at college students. And you guys aren't doing this, but I just want to make clear that if people are picking teams here, I'm on team. Human beings, by virtue of their birth, have dignity and worth. And I do think that the tribalism of the left is a response to the fact that there are a lot of people in this country that just believe that they're better than other people because of their culture, because of how much money they have, because of their race or their religion. And I think you can draw a line from that to trigger warnings and to safe spaces. Doesn't mean that I'm okay with trigger warnings and safe spaces. Just that I understand where it all comes from.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's actually a really, really important point that people I don't think see very often. Is that it's almost I can't remember where this idea came from. I think it came from Dave Rubin. Well, I heard it from Dave Rubin, but I think he got it from somewhere. This this horseshoe effect, where you can sort of think of a horseshoe shape, and on the one side you have, sort of left-leaning people, on the other side you have right-leaning people. And as they get further toward the sort of authoritarian edges of their side, they actually get closer together, and they end up acting similarly authoritarian, similarly tyrannical. And I think you're right that is a direct response to the authoritarian, tyrannical leanings of the opposite side, whatever side you look at. And especially the left is absolutely Jordan Peterson, I think, he brings up this characterization of the principal role of the left politically in society is to protect marginalized people, to make sure that people in whatever groups they're part of are not being put down or oppressed because of their membership with that group. So I did want to make that point, but yeah.
Sorry, what was the question before I went on my own tangent? What was that?
Oh, no, I was just trying to just drill down on what, like, specifically we were referencing when talking about free speech on college campuses, just so people have an idea of what is something that would be not okay on a university campus that we think would be better if it was able to be expressed and then basically put down via criticism.
I mean, before I answer that question, also, I think I made this sort of clear in my when I first met Chase. I sort of felt that there were many people in the audience who they had lots of examples of free speech being oppressed or repressed, suppressed on campus, and they took them not from their own personal experience, but from the news. And it's really easy to sort of extrapolate based on really awful headlines to like the general case. So I don't really know how it's interesting when I have conversations with my friends and I talk about the dangers of suppressing speech on campuses. Their response is that to me is that this is a problem, but it's not nearly as big of a problem as the cases we see featured in the national news would make it seem. So that's like the first point I would make. The second is, I don't know. I think I've heard examples of certain, like take Israel, for example. Like what, I've heard it's very hard to be a Zionist on campus. Is it hard to be a Zionist on campus? But I've heard many different stories of people being harassed and shouted down and yelled at, and even the people not being friends with people that believe in the state of Israel or think it's a good and decent nation. So that's one example, I think, of an idea which is not tolerated at all. I mean, it's okay to have the other idea. I mean, I disagree with it. But it seems like advocating for the state of Israel, wholeheartedly believing in the state of Israel on many college campuses today might alienate you from large part of the student body. Maybe that's true. That's the impression I've gotten from other people.
Yeah, and I like how you kind of caveat that, because most of these things are things we've heard on the news. Like when I was there, I don't think I expressed any or even necessarily held any, opinions that were controversial, but I never saw it. It's just there's maybe 3 examples per year in the news, and like you said, everything is blown up so much that I don't know if it's actually something to be worried about. I personally don't seem to think so.
So I'm not sure either. I would say that I've heard of many different incidents and many different campuses in places I wouldn't necessarily expect either. I also talked to friends of mine that are graduates of Berkeley College in California, and they've been graduates for years. They say the stuff that I'm talking about and that you guys are talking about, it existed, but it was all on the periphery. You could ignore it. You could be in Berkeley and be completely apolitical. The vast majority of folks at Berkeley College didn't care about these politicized issues. So that's one point. I also, to counter myself, I would say that our society, one of the problems is that extremists govern the debate. Extremists, because extremists, by virtue of their extremism, care more, they're the ones that are talking the loudest. They're the ones that are yelling. They're the ones that are voting. The people that have reasonable points of view, they just don't feel fueled as much to get involved. So it's like there's a challenge. How do you get moderate people who by definition are sort of temperate to be fundamentalist about their moderation? I don't know. But it's
and like you said, our whole system of government relies on people's compromise. So if only the people on the edges are talking, if you realize there's a need for that compromise, your voice kind of gets shut out, at least in a world where the thing that will get the most clicks will be the thing that gets to the front. And I don't know. I guess I'd ask you, is that, or has that always been a consistent trend in America? Back in 1800 in the newspapers, was it the most controversial thing that got on the front page, or was it?
I don't know. I mean, I think it has to be an element of that. At the same time, good ideas went viral. I mean, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, I think in 1776, sold it's like a fourth of Americans owned a copy or something crazy like that. And it might have been controversial, but it wasn't crazy. It was just the idea that we shouldn't have a fucking king. Right. So there's an element that the controversial becomes more popular. But there's another thing too. I think people that are sort of temperate and reasonable need to sort of get in the fray. They need to have the courage to stand up for certain things. And it's hard if you're in college. Mm-hmm. You want to make friends and you're a reasonable guy, you have a date the next day, you have a good social life, you're doing well in school. Why are you going to want to deal with the crazy college kids that are screaming about anything? You don't want to deal with that. And I suppose, I had this conversation with another thing we should probably just look at and consider is that a lot of kids, they're in college, they're experimenting with ideas. Through age, people accumulate wisdom and moderation. Their theories sort of have to rub up against reality. People become much more practical as they grow older. There's a joke about how people become Republican when they get old.
It's if you're not liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart. If you're not conservative when you're old, you don't have a brain.
Exactly, something like that. I always sort of thought that as a partisan statement, but it's not. Conservative is not a partisan. That just means you think that things shouldn't change drastically. You're very nervous when things are changing because you realize how hard it is to change for the better. So I think there's also an element that the kids that we're most concerned about are the kids that are concerning the free speech crowd. Many of them are going to become mature adults in the next couple of years. Hopefully. And I think part of that has to do with a civil society that's functioning and that works. Because the more you can graduate college and you get a job that really fills your life with, not every job has to fill your life with joy, but if it fills your life with some modicum of happiness, you can get a family, you're just not going to care about silly asinine things as much. You're going to care about the big important life things. Do we have a civil society that's flourishing and that can moderate a lot of this stuff we're seeing on college campuses? That's another question. I don't know.
To sort of bring that out into the bigger political discourse with things like political polarization seeming to be on the rise. So you and your sister have this podcast that you produce called When I Lived There. And it's a great podcast. I've been enjoying it. And one of your guests, Shaul Bakash, grew up in Iran. And one of the things that he mentioned was that sort of on the precipice of the sort of I don't know whether you want to call it revolution or on the precipice of this sort of big political explosion, there was no political center. Everybody was pushed to the extremes, and all you saw was very radical political polarization. Do you see our current state of political polarization mirroring anything like that, or do you think this is sort of a different case for whatever reason?
I definitely think it's a different case. Like, I don't think we're going to wake up tomorrow and there's going to be Revolutionary Guard down the street. Like, I don't think that's in our future either. But that being said, I think our country is becoming more and more radicalized. There are a lot of people, and this has to do with the breakdown of our society. Like, people become radical when they can't live normal, healthy, joyful lives, when they aren't being spiritually nourished through their career and through their families and through their social lives, even through patriotism. They will look for nourishment however they can. People need meaning and purpose and connection. It's literally, it's a requirement to go on. And I think if you look at communities where people suffer from opioid addiction and from suicide, it's because there's an absence of purpose and meaning. People used to derive so much meaning from their jobs, wherever they were. Those jobs have been shipped overseas, or they've been downgraded in society. They're not viewed by the rest of us as prestigious. Who knows? But there are lots of people in this country on both the left and the right and the center that really they're not doing well in terms of meaning and purpose. And so they search out alternative ways to make them feel that way. And extremist political philosophy is one way people can feel meaning and purpose. Feeling the tribe, however you define it, can really fill people with purpose and meaning. And so, I see tribalism on the rise in this country. And it really does worry me, because what's driving a lot of it is there's a lot of change in this country. There's economic change, there's cultural change. There are people that are holding on to what they think America means, and that meaning is being, and to be perfectly honest, their understanding of what America is not enlightened or in line with America's true values. And reckoning with our original sin, reckoning with our past injustices, I think that undermines their quote unquote culture, their sense of patriotism. And that forces them to look for other ways, along with economic dislocation, to find meaning and purpose. And some of those ways are very unproductive, like Donald Trump, to me, is just a byproduct or is a function of people needing spiritual fuel that they're not getting in more productive places. And I think there are other elements. That story I could tell on all sides of the political spectrum, not just the right. I think it's far less problematic on the left than it's the right, but that's happening on the left as well. I think if you look our society, I'm an atheist, but you have to acknowledge that sort of established religions provided people with spiritual nourishment, have reliably provided them with spiritual nourishment, and our country's becoming increasingly secular. Something has to replace the spiritual nourishment of the established religions. What's replacing that? I don't know. It's harder and harder to get a stable job, to pay for a home, to find meaning and satisfaction in your workplace. People are living farther and farther away from their families, from their parents. They're dislocated. So there's just so many different factors in this country on all sides that are contributing to this void. And people need to fill the void, and they fill it Trumpism or I hesitate to say that college kids are filling that void with not respecting free speech, but I think there's like an element tribalism on all sides, however you define it.
And, somebody's need for purpose, if they feel like they are standing up for the underprivileged and, those who need it, that gives a very clear purpose that, I would say probably fills you morally and gives you a path.
Absolutely.
Where, So I think it's totally understandable.
I think I've sort of grappled with people's true motivations for doing things for a while. I always was like, why is this person doing that? And then I just realized, you know what? We all have our own motivations for why we do things. And we start looking around for whether or not people's motivations are legitimate. It's just so many of our motivations, I feel like, are very human and similar. Like people are ambitious, they're driven, they're competitive, they're complicated, they're also good and decent. So I think college kids, or just you could say there are members in the left which are motivated by that fills them with purpose to do good. But to a certain extent, that's great. We just sort of, in my mind, I would want to sort of change their path a little bit.
And I even went through that myself when I was younger, like high school age. I was very involved in the anti-hydrofracking movement in New York State. And not to say like my opinions have changed that much, but I feel like the way the discussions that we had were, I was too involved almost. I was too emotional about it. Now where I feel like I'm not emotional enough about things, almost like the horseshoe effect, not politically, but I've gone from believing a lot of things very intensely and feeling what it's like to push for those things to almost a apathy or lack of like a feeling like I can't really do too much about things. And I feel like that comes back to your point about people in the middle, or people who understand the need to do things that are important, need to actually step up and do stuff. And I think that's something when I was more idealistic, I was able to do, and now I have a hard time doing.
Idealism definitely is very energizing. I don't know. I think one of the things we all need to do better as human beings, as citizens of the same country, is just find a way. If there are people out there that you don't have empathy for, and you, for whatever reason, have contempt for, just find a way. Just connect with them. I promise that you will soon find that your contempt is replaced with understanding. One really interesting thing is with my civics group, I'm kind of a controversial person. People can rub me the wrong way. I get into arguments a lot of the time, even with my really good friends. But when people come to my civics group and want to learn, or just want to like have a community of people, especially now when our political situation is so dire, there's no ounce of judgment really in my head. I just don't judge them. It's not like I don't show judgment. I mean, there may have been like occasions, but very rare. It's because I sort of, just the presence there, wanting to talk about issues of the day is so humanizing. They're trying to make the situation better. Mm-hmm. They're trying to connect with their fellow citizens. They're not trying to yell or scream. And if like people are willing, just willing to give someone give someone a chance. So that's, I think, part of our job as citizens right now, because we are so tribalized and partisan. Just reach out to people that aren't in your group, aren't in your bubble, aren't in your tribe, and who might have ideas completely opposed to yours. You don't even have to change their points of view at all. Just sort of get on the same playing field. Like, you're both human beings, you're both Americans, and you both like want to live good lives with like joy and happiness. You want to have a good career and a good family, and like that. Everyone pretty much wants that. Like and so we're all sort of the same, and we just sort of acknowledge that and just realize that we sort of have different philosophies, but we need to figure out a way to live together. I think things will be really different. It's just that what I'm describing, reaching out to people who are in different bubbles and tribes, is difficult because I live in Brooklyn. Well, right now I actually I live in Brooklyn for a little bit longer. A lot of people here are in the same tribe politically. And you go somewhere else and they're in the same opposing tribe. So it's really hard. And like our Facebook is the same tribe. Our Twitter is the same tribe. How do you reach out and humanize others? But we need to find a way. We really do.
So I do want to be mindful of your time, but one more question on this topic. We discussed a lot of sort of the left-wing threat to free speech and, whether the magnitude of that threat is overblown. What do you think is the right-wing threat to free speech?
Oh, I think the right-wing threat to free speech, and this isn't with. It's important to recognize that I don't look at Trump voters as Trump. There's a huge difference between someone who just decides to vote for somebody once every 4 years and then the person that they're voting for. But I think that there's a substantial percentage of Americans that don't necessarily who don't believe in our democratic institutions. And they look at Trump as sort of like their leader. They're sort of, and that's so antithetical to our traditions and institutions and governing principles as a nation that it really scares me. And I guess how to relate to free speech is that there are a lot of people in this country that don't view speech through the lens of the marketplace of ideas. They use speech as a weapon to beat the other side. That's why, and we can talk about how this happens in the left, but I think it happens far more on the right. There's literally a propaganda network designed to lie to the American people constantly. That is a massive distortion in the marketplace of ideas. The leader of our country is lying to his people, like as a matter of principle. There's no marketplace of ideas. He's not trying to win truth over falsity. He is basically just trying to convince people of an alternate reality. And I think there are some of his followers, I don't know what percentage, who actually feel the same way. That use Fox. They aren't necessarily manipulated by Fox. I think deep down they might even know they're being manipulated. Maybe, I don't know what percentage this is, but that they sort of leverage that falsity, that false narrative for political gain. And that's really troubling to me, because if the people don't believe in democracy and the different things that make democracy work, like free speech, then the laws will at some point reflect that, because culture is why we have the laws. What's in people's minds, or you could draw a straight line from what people believe in and the laws, at least in a democracy. So that to me is the main threat of free speech from the right, is that there are really deeply held undemocratic beliefs on the right wing, both especially by the party leadership and the people in power and by Fox News, and to a certain extent by some unknown percentage of Trump voters, and that use words, that use speech, that use arguments not to come to some sort of consensus, not to figure out what's true or not, or righteous or not, or good or not, but to essentially beat the other tribe. And that's really harmful. I mean, you could look at Alex Jones, for example, and just the amount of propaganda there is, it's really scary.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like we could talk about this topic for ages. I mean, it's, even expanding into the other functions of the Constitution and the government, it's a very, very interesting topic. But before we move on, is there any are there any key points that you think you want to just hit again, or anything that I missed in that?
No, I would say that it's really important for us as a nation. There needs to be a critical mass of people that are on the same page about these important issues.
Yeah.
And we need to do whatever we can to get on that same page. Each of us needs to be an advocate for the important principles underlying our Constitution, our country. And we need to convince our fellow citizens of the righteousness of them. So that's what I would say. We need to be fearless.
Yeah. Alex, did you have any closing thoughts on this topic?
I would just say I think it's really important what you said about, we all have pretty much the same goals. So to view one another as the other doesn't make sense. So yeah, that's basically it. Just think about people as people first, and then think about their ideas. And you can have friends that think totally different things than you, but still work together to figure out a common goal. So
absolutely,
that's one thing that Alex and I have been sort of on the same page with this podcast, is we really want to drill home the idea that people are not their ideas, and no idea is above scrutiny, but no person is beneath dignity. That's a Majid Nawaz quote that on our very first episode I opened with, because I think that's such an important thing to remember in this whole process.
I agree.
So with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to something we like to call the off topic. And, it can be anything. It could be a philosophical idea. It could be a charity. It could be something somebody said to you in line at the grocery store. Danny, what do you have for us?
That's a really good question. It seems like everything in my life right now is on the same topic, which makes my life boring and frustrating. My girlfriend can't stand it. That every time she comes home and we talk about things, I'm just talking about politics and federalism. She's sick of it. So it's like everything is on topic, or like my podcast and authoritarianism, which is the same topic really. And my off topic with you guys was going to be about the midterms.
Okay.
But it's still really on topic.
Well, it's separate from free speech, so we can go with it.
Yeah, no, it's separate from free speech. I guess, I think you guys are younger than me. I think I'm 35, far younger. And I don't know. I think that young people tend not to vote as nearly as much as other demographics, as other age groups. And I'm not really sure why, but I think the midterm elections in 2018 are really important to the future of our country. Like, I think that at the moment, there is a Republican Congress that is not doing its job as a separate branch of government, and is combined with the presidency to be this sort of massive tribe that wants to do all sorts of harm to our institutions and to our democracy. And it's not that I think our country's going to fall apart and there's going to be a civil war if the Democrats don't take back Congress, but I think things get very messy and very dangerous and very troubling. And I think certain institutions of ours could really be undermined permanently if we don't somehow find a way to check the president of the United States. So I've been thinking, like, how do you get people to view the political situation the same way I do and then vote for Democrat, wherever they are in November, to vote for Democratic Congress people? I'm not a Democrat. I'm an independent. But how do you get people just to, and there are some folks, maybe you guys, that think that even though there are presidential elections, there's essentially an autocracy for 4 or 8 years. The president is unconstrained in his powers. I would disagree, but maybe that idea that you share is shared by lots of other people like you. How I'm thinking, like, what is the best way to get through to folks like you guys, to young people, that if they came out and voted, I mean, I think the Democrats will take back the House anyway, but it would be a sure thing.
Yeah.
And so how do you get people to sort of perform the same calculus that I am? And I've been thinking this through. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are too. I mean, Bloomberg, I think, just gave $80 million. And Bloomberg's not a Democrat either, but he gave $80 million to Democratic candidates for the midterm elections. But again, fundamentally, it's about voters. How do you convince people to vote for Democrats? Not because they're Democrats, but because of sort of the calculus I outlined. Yeah. And I don't know, that's kind of, I would like to talk to you guys about that. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe, I want Joe Rogan to have a podcast episode about voting. Why isn't Joe? I mean, I don't know why. Can you imagine what? Who do you think his listeners are voting for? I have no idea.
I think most of them are probably not voting. I think the big issue that I see is the attitude of my vote doesn't really count. Especially if you live in like a very politically one-sided state. Like I'm in New York, right? Or we're both in New York.
Yeah.
And there's this sense of, well, New York always goes blue, and like that's obviously myopic to just the context of the presidential election, but it's also, it leads people to think, well, New York's going to vote a certain way, and what's my one drop in the pond going to make a difference?
It's interesting though. It's like people recycle, right? But recycling makes no difference at all. I mean, clearly, I don't want to get backlash for saying that. Recycling in the aggregate is really important, but compare the help you're doing to the environment by recycling to the harm China does in any given day. I think China produced more concrete in 3 years than America did in the 20th century. So, it's really, I think people need to get into good habits. Voting is a good habit. It's also part of your job as a citizen. And also, so that's my point. A lot of people, when I talk to them and say, my vote doesn't matter, either because I'm in a blue state or the congressional district is blue. Well, then call up your friend who lives in Modesto, California, who's not going to vote, and tell him to vote. Explain to him to vote. Take time out of your day to vote, because it's really important. You don't think your vote matters in a presidential election? Well, it could matter in a congressional district. If it was your goal, Chase, to convince 50 people in Modesto, California, 50 is a lot. Let's say it's your goal to convince 10 people to vote from the congressional candidate there, the Democrat candidate there in November. Could you? I think so. It'd be hard, maybe.
It'd probably be hard.
But I think you could. Yeah. So I think you could. I mean, you're a clever guy. You're smart. You're hardworking. You will have a goal and you will try to meet it. I think really what's missing here is people don't feel motivated because they don't think that the situation is as dire as I think it is. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think the situation is really dire. And we have a president who does not believe in the rule of law, who does not believe in free and fair elections. And we need to stand up to him.
Yeah. I think one thing that I kind of mentioned this earlier, but how our generation doesn't necessarily feel like the stakes are real. Like, how much did it feel like our lives changed from one election to the other in terms of the impact on our lives? So I think convincing people that, this is a long-term game, and it's hard to get people to care about, something 50 years in the future.
Yeah, that's a problem too. I mean, you look at, I really don't want to compare. I'm not comparing. I'm using this as an analogy because I think an analogical reasoning is important, but I'm not comparing Nazi Germany to America. But from 1932 to 1939, Germany, from non-Jews, non-gays, the folks that were not against the regime, living in Germany wasn't just okay. It was a revitalized period of time. Hitler's rise was a good thing for those 7 years for most Germans. Yeah. They were filled with joy. They felt purpose and meaning. their economic fortunes were higher, and people reaped the benefit, or didn't reap the benefit. They suffered the consequences, because eventually corrupted power leads back to everyday lives. And I think we need to make people understand that even though this political conflict we're facing now feels like it's far away, what does it mean? Why does it matter if the president's undermining the rule of law? Well, it matters because that means that power is serving itself and not serving you. And it means there's no constraint on power. And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what that means is that at some point, power will come for what you have if you are in its way. And this is a timeless theme. In all autocracies and oligarchies, all dictatorships, this has happened. So, we just need to find some way. I need to find some way. Thousands of other people need to find some way to make our political situation seem urgent. Not 5 years from now, but now. And maybe we won't be able to, but I hope we can.
Actually, I think the example you brought up at first of recycling might be a good place to start. Like, I don't know what the historical model looks like for convincing people that recycling was important, but sort of I'm going to go off on a little tangent here just to give some context. I've been doing these like endurance challenge events, and these some of them are like skills based things. And we actually had a guy. It's a thing called GoRuck, and our third episode of the podcast, episode 2, was with one of the guys who runs this, and it's all retired and sometimes current special operations forces from the U.S. military. But one of the cool things that I learned was the role of Green Berets in combat, the U.S. Army Special Forces. And one of the things they do, like their big mission is to get on the ground, and rather than being the fighting force themselves, they help cultivate a local fighting force, or help cultivate, a local environment that's conducive to their goals. They're not always, sometimes they are, the shooters kicking down doors or whatever, but the skill that they use to their advantage that makes them unique in the special operations community is their ability to, manipulate groups of people, and, whether it's gathering militias or getting people to have a certain political opinion. And obviously that's a military context, but I think one of the things that I've learned from that, and that I'm sort of trying to pull together here, is that when you have models for getting people to behave in a certain way, you can analyze them and find details that will help you build a model for another context, which is why the recycling thing that sort of brought this whole idea into my head of, if you can look at the historical context of how we convinced people that recycling is important, to the point where, like, it's just a reflex for people who have. And
it is important. I didn't mean to make light of it. No. It is important.
It's an apolitical reflex for many people, right? And how did that happen? Where did that come from? So if we look at that model, maybe that's how you get people to vote. And voting becomes this reflex of like, well, yeah, that's just my civic duty, right? So I don't know if that's a good starting point, but that's my idea.
That's a great idea.
Maybe you should talk to some Green Berets, get them to help you.
I have a friend that was a Green Beret. I'll talk to him about it.
Yeah. And that social stigma around recycling now too. Like if you see somebody throw something out the car window ahead of you, you're like, wow, what an asshole.
Yeah, then there are also like people that are judged
and
for like voting for conventional political candidates.
Yeah.
Oh, you voted for Hillary Clinton?
Yeah.
She's part of the system, dude. Like, but anyway.
And you got that from everywhere in the past election. No matter who you voted for, you're going to get judged hard, So I think that could be part of it. It's the opposite. It's society's judgment of you, encouraging you not to vote.
With certain people, with certain age groups.
Yeah.
How old are you guys? Just curious.
I'm 24. Actually, we're both 24.
Nice.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Danny, thanks so much for giving your time to us today. This has been awesome. really happy with the way this went. If people want to sort of learn more about, the things that you're involved in, places to go, where can they find you?
You can follow me on Twitter at Daniel Miller ESQ. You can go on YouTube, type in Modern Patriotism, and subscribe to my YouTube channels. I have videos about different constitutional topics. I have a podcast with my sister. It's called When I Lived There. It's about authoritarianism and what daily life is like in those sorts of regimes. And I have a civics group called the Society for Constitutional Protection on Meetup. So you should join it. Those are lots of different things. Just pick one of them, maybe.
Yeah, and that's in New York, right?
Yeah, it's in New York. And I look forward to interacting with your listeners in some other venue sometime.
Awesome. Well, yeah, Danny, thanks so much.
And thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Danny.
Absolutely.